Fam, let's bring on Mark. What do you say?
Yes, let's do it here, fam. If you want to go ahead and start with the first question while I pull up the slides.
Okay, you pull up the slides, Mark. It's great to see you. I called you our senior analyst because you've now been on the show more than any other guest yet right now. Now, you, number one, you're at the top of the hill.
I'm glad it's not because I'm old. That's it.
Well, I mean, you're wise. That's why we sought you out, too, because you're great at foreign policy, especially in this region. So when this stuff was going on, I said, we got to get Mark on the show right away. Before we get to Kazakhstan, let's talk a little about Ukraine and Russia, since you're so close there and you have so much knowledge. Western media is saying that Russia is invading Ukraine. I mean, this is what you hear on MSNBC, even the liberal channels here. But Russian troops have been there, moving around their own border, and NATO-backed troops have been expanding. Is Russia doing anything wrong, or is the West just trying to manufacture consent to push NATO up to the border?
Yeah, well, that all depends on your position. It is subjective. Is Russia doing something wrong? Do you regard the regime that's in Kiev as legitimate? They seized power with open U.S. and Western support. Victoria Nuland, the neocon maven, wife of Robert Kagan, out handing cookies in Maidan Square. I mean, do you think the United States would allow foreign countries, officials and politicians to come into Washington and to cheerlead on and support crowds that were calling for the overthrow of the Biden government? No, of course not. That's a coup. That's egregious meddling. It was a putsch.
Yeah.
It was violent. It was unconstitutional. They had a Banderite right.
Real quick. So let me just to make sure we know that we do look at it as illegitimate. But Russia has since then acknowledged that the current government in Ukraine is the legitimate government.
No.
Zelensky, correct?
No, that is not true. No.
So please hear.
Yeah, they have recognized the comedian turned president of the regime as the de facto authorities in Ukraine. That is the difference. The Russian position is until they politically reconcile with the people of the east of their own country, the Donbass, that have never accepted the overthrow of the government back in 2014. According to the Minsk Accords, the Minsk II Accords, that were approved by the UN Security Council, by a UN Security Council resolution, which the US signed on to, and thus became international law. Until Kiev fulfills them, which they have dragged on for over 7 years now and refuse to fulfill, because it would mean sitting down with the leadership in Donbass. It would mean granting a degree of federalization to the Donbass and possibly to other parts of the country. It would mean a general amnesty. The political crisis it would ensue, the ultra-nationalists, the Banderite fascists that back the regime in Kiev would turn on it. There would be a second, or depending on how you count it, a third Maidan, and then the regime would fall. So they refuse to fulfill it. And the US and the EU, they are perfectly happy with that. And what Russia has seen is, while these years have dragged on, the frozen conflict continues. Daily, there are artillery shelling of the Donbass, residential areas, wounded, injured, every single day. These people live half in and out of their basements, right, as bomb shelters. This has continued. And what Russia sees now is the de facto on-the-ground NATOization of Ukraine. There are some, according to the Russian government, some 10,000 NATO trainers and advisors on the ground in Ukraine now. 10,000 of them, right? That shades of Vietnam for anyone, right? That's how you creep into a conflict. There are... the United Kingdom has announced that they're going to be building military bases in Ukraine, naval bases on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Turkey, a NATO member, has sold the regime in Kiev advanced combat drones. Yet Turkey's actually become a drone power. I know it's a weird world, but that it has the Bayraktar TB2, and they have used them in violation of the Minsk Accords to conduct airstrikes of the Donbass. And the US and the UK keep piling more and more advanced weapons, missile systems into the regime in Kiev, which, of course, they're using to kill their own people, right? Their own people, the people of East Ukraine. Not Russians, certainly, at least not at the moment. And what Russia sees with this ongoing, NATOization on the ground, the status quo is just no longer acceptable, right? The status quo is cementing NATO militarily in place in Ukraine, and the body count in East Ukraine keeps going up. So they made demands, and I think it's fair to call them demands, ultimatums to the U.S. and NATO. They sent them draft security treaties and said, look, we've got serious security issues here, and if you do not agree to stop the eastward expansion of NATO, agree that Ukraine and Georgia should be neutral countries as a buffer between NATO and the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, because these are internally divided countries that you have meddled in and exploited the divisions and brought to power political forces, that are intent on dragging the countries into NATO. But we don't regard that as legitimate. It's not representative of the people, the entire population of the countries. You need to stop conducting these massive war drills on our borders. In November, the U.S. was running strategic bombing drills, nuclear-capable bombers, in the Black Sea to Crimea. In the month of November, they did this 30 times. That is nuclear bombing drills, right? Yeah. Every single day, right? That's insane, right? Of course, Russia is scared at this point. Of course, they see NATO as a threat. Anyone who says that NATO is a defensive organization is in la-la land. I mean, I served in the U.S. military. I served in NATO operations. NATO has never, ever been used defensively against another state. It has been used offensively as a platform for U.S. military power in Libya, in Syria, in Serbia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, that NATO and its member states. Of course, Russia has reason to fear.
Mark, aren't they breaking a treaty or a promise made where NATO said they wouldn't expand eastward?
Yeah. There was no actual treaty. Let's face it.
Okay.
Gorbachev was a naive, senile old guy who trusted the West at their word. And when they, pinky swore with their fingers behind their back that, right, if he dissolved, the Warsaw Pact and allowed Germany to reunify, that NATO would not move one step forward. And it wasn't just U.S. leaders. It was actually multiple Western leaders. The documentation is out there. The archives have been open. Anyone who says it didn't happen, but it wasn't in writing. It wasn't legally binding. And they just laughed at him behind their hands, right? And Putin's opinion is that is no longer acceptable. And Russia is no longer a weak pushover, more countries can just be color revolutioned on its borders, and Russia just has to accept that. They won't anymore. They're not going to accept it. They now see themselves in a Cuban Missile Crisis scenario. They're at an existential security moment for Russia. So unless the U.S. and NATO agreed to these demands, which they have refused to, then Russia has said, we'll have to take our security into our own hands. We will have to guarantee our own security. And we will do that by military technical measures. What does that mean? What are military tech? That is the U.S. diplomatic speak equivalent of saying all options are on the table. And because the U.S. is saying that right now, both countries are saying to each other, all options are on the table, which is pretty frightening. But that could mean putting new hypersonic missile systems in Kaliningrad. It could mean reopening Russian military bases in Cuba or putting them in Venezuela, or it could mean a military intervention in Ukraine of some form. And I would say that is where things are going at this moment. I don't think any final decision has been made yet. The Kremlin is waiting for a formal written response from the White House after their meetings. But I think that's where things are going. Russia is not massing troops on the Ukrainian border, right? That's a simplification. Actually, Ukraine, meaning the Kiev regime, has more forces on the border than Russia. They have half of their military, 125,000 troops on the border, which also means, right there on Donbass, presenting a threat to that. But the Russian military has created logistical centers a couple hundred kilometers back in Western Russia that if they're given the order that this is the decision that Putin is making, this is the option that he will take, they can then in short order start a military buildup and conduct an intervention in Ukraine. That's too complicated to explain to most people. No, there is not a mass Russian military buildup on the border more than there has been for the last 7 years since the civil conflict and proxy war started. But yes, Russia has moved military assets into the west of their own country in a position where, yes, they could launch an intervention within a couple of weeks if the decision is made. And I'd say 60% likely that is where things are going in February.
Mark, quickly, you mentioned these red lines that Russia is drawing, but let's go back. You said 7 years of this conflict. How did the backing of the U.S. and the West of neo-Nazis in 2014 affect directly what's happening right now? Because I see, obviously, I believe from what I've seen that these are the consequences of a lot of those interventions, correct?
Yeah, now, you take a look, the leaders of Ukraine are not themselves neo-Nazis, but the vanguard, the ideological people on the street who fought this regime into power they are Banderite fascists. They are the heirs of the World War II era West Ukrainian Nazi collaborators. West Ukraine wasn't even part of Ukraine up until just before World War II. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for hundreds of years. They hate Russians. Unlike East Ukrainians who see Russians as fraternal brothers, sisters, people across the border just like us. In fact, my cousin, my wife, there's so much intermarriage there. It is two competing conceptions of Ukrainian national identity and what Ukraine is. And you can pull up any election map in Ukraine, any sociological poll for the last 30 years and see that almost geographical divide, straight down the middle. To deny it is simply denying reality. And that is, still what is going on here. And Ukraine was okay. They were maintaining their stability as a country by balancing between the east of the west of the country, which meant geopolitically staying neutral, not siding with the West, not joining NATO, not signing with Russia. But that neutrality is no longer acceptable to the U.S. As far as they've concerned, they've geopolitically flipped the country, and it is now in their camp. They have a regime in power that wants it to be so. They've repressed the opposition in the East, the political voices. The leader is now imprisoned. All the media outlets, TV, the internet, the major publications that were critical of the government from the east of the country have all been shut down. They've all been banned. And at the same time, the U.S. is saying that Ukraine is a democracy. It's Orwellian. It is Orwellian doublespeak. It is now pro-U.S. It is pro-Western, but it is not democratic in the slightest. And still, these militias, these Banderite fascist militias, these West Ukrainian ultra-nationalists, they are now, not only do they have still military militia formations, but they are integrated into the security services, the police, the military, the major political parties. One of the advisors of the General Chief of Staff of the Ukrainian military is Dmitry Yarosh, the founder and head of the right sector. I mean, and to say that because Zelensky is Jewish, this is just Russian propaganda, that's nonsense. Because you forget that the one thing that the Nazis killed more of than the Jewish people is Russians and leftists. And as long as these West Ukrainian ultra-nationalist Banderite fascists, the principal object of their hatred is ethnic Russians, leftists, and Slovak East Ukrainians who look favorably on, Russia and the Soviet Union, that violence is okay. That hatred is acceptable. Those are neo-Nazis that serve U.S. foreign policy goals. They are moderate neo-Nazis, to use the terminology from Syria all over again. We've seen this in South and Central America. We've seen it in the Middle East. Now we see it in Ukraine. And actually, there's a long history. The U.S. supported these same people's grandparents at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. And they're going to do it again because we have word now that the CIA ground branch paramilitary has been training these same Ukrainian far-right paramilitaries for the last 7 years to launch a insurgency campaign if Russia intervened in Ukraine. And now it's about to be launched, and that would just hit the news in the last week.
It's kind of great to have you on right now because you're not going to get this information on MSNBC or CNN. And this is when I first started following Mark Sleboda, was in 2014, kind of understanding the situation. And now we've come full circle today. And it's also not surprising, Mark, that now that the band is back together, meaning the Biden administration, all the John Sullivans, the Victoria Nulands, the Anthony Blinken, it's back in the Ukraine again. These people have a disdain for Russia. But my question to you right now is that we saw Crimea was annexed, right? Obviously, we've had talk before.
My wife is Crimean.
Yeah.
And she would not accept that terminology at all.
They decided to break off and join Russia.
They had a referendum.
Absolutely.
You don't have to believe Russia. You can believe Pew or Gallup or GFK. 93% plus of Crimeans wanted to get out of Dodge in Ukraine. Their autonomy was taken away, and they wanted to rejoin Russia.
You know what? I used the wrong terminology. Russia did accept them with open arms, right?
Of course.
Yeah. Now, my question to you is this. Obviously, you said on the show before, Russia doesn't want to take Ukraine back. That would be way too much. They don't want to deal with it. But why not the Donbass region, right? I mean, wouldn't that at least, if they were able to join Mother Russia, because there's mostly ethnic-speaking Russians there, the Donbass region and that other particular reason, if they join Russia, that would at least then solve the problem of the kind of quote-unquote civil war that's been propped and fueled by the West. Would it not? I mean, it might not solve the NATO issue, but it would solve that one issue, no?
Well, first of all, actually, the regime in Kiev actually controls a majority of Donbass. It is only the major cities of Donetsk and Lugansk, which are the most heavily populated parts of Donbass, that are actually part of the NLNR. So there's really no clear dividing line. And if you take a look at the polls in East Ukraine, the elections, they don't support the government in Kiev. They never have. They didn't support Poroshenko. Zelensky, his approval ratings are now like 20%. In the East, it's practically zero, right? The people of East Ukraine are, at this point, politically, economically suffering just almost as much as the people in Donbass. Obviously, they're not living under the shelling as well. And Russia, at this point, when they see, the situation of this NATOization on the ground, I think that they see right now that East Ukraine is just the Donbass is probably not enough. I think they're looking at rooting this cancer in Kiev out at the source. West Ukraine may be a lost cause. They may never give up on West Ukraine and tell the West to take it. But the way I think I see things, because of the amount of Russian forces that have now moved into Belarus border from Kiev is only 80 kilometers. That's a really short distance. And that would be a very capable decapitation strike. I think they can root out the regime in Kiev, that seized power there in 2014. I think that is what is as at least one of the options. Again, I don't think a final decision has been made, but that I think would solve more of Russia's and the people of East Ukraine's problem at this point, more than simply trying to absorb the Donbass. I think they would be much happier with a government that was reflective of the people of Donbass as well.
You're saying they're going to regime change the regime change?
Yeah, I think that is definitely on the table.
Okay. Sam, go ahead. I'm sorry.
To be fair, I was arguing for that since 2014, as were some of Putin's advisors. And they thought that this farce in Kiev would collapse over time. And, it continues to collapse, but it never collapses.
You talked about where we're at and where you think this is headed, but is there any possibility of other nations getting involved? We've seen the conflict between Russia and the United States countless times, and a lot of the alarms raised. But this time around, I think things are different geopolitically in the macro sense. You have China getting involved in a lot of countries via the Belt and Road Initiative. You have Iran also getting involved in Latin America and also in the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see any strengthening of these alliances between Russia, Iran, China, and perhaps other nations as this is happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, the ongoing, it's essentially an alliance now. I mean, the cat is out of the bag between Russia and China. Of course, they're not going to get involved in Ukraine themselves, but they have, given Russia the blessing, just as Russia is supporting China on Taiwan, with the U.S. supporting, separatist forces in Taiwan. Belarus would probably get involved because Belarus now has their own beefs with the regime in Kiev. That, this latest regime change attempt in Belarus was launched out of Ukraine to a large extent, and they ran this Ukrainian intelligence operation to try to disrupt their elections by luring Russian security contractors and telling Lukashenko there that they were there as Russians to overthrow the government. It created a little bit of turmoil there, but it was quickly discovered for what it was. But they've got their own beef, and I think that they may participate in this. But the NATO, Biden has said that U.S. troops would not be involved. And with some 10,000 NATO trainers and advisors just in the past few days, the UK and Canada have both sent more special forces into the country. Supposedly, they would be withdrawn if Russia does intervene. It would have to be an Afghanistan-style massive airlift and evacuation out of the country, getting the diplomatic personnel out and so on. It could be another fiasco. And there's so much possibility there for Americans to kill Russians or Russians to kill Americans if the U.S. is trying to get out of the country, to get thousands, but supposedly some 4,000 American military trainers and advisors on the ground out of that NATO 10,000. It could be a mess getting them out of the country in a hurry if Russia does launch a major intervention.
The last question I have about Ukraine, I think it's important because sometimes we have to look a little bit down the road. Zelensky, right? Some of our friends in independent media have kind of labeled Zelensky as a Western puppet of sorts. Is he that? Because I still remember the classic video of him trying to go talk to some of these militias to back off the people of the Donbass region and whatnot, and they were pretty much ignoring him. And the reason why I asked this question, Mark, is if Russia tries to make a regime change in Ukraine by the same token in which the United States helped Yeltsin get elected, and they try to win through the elections, in other words, try to find a candidate that's going to be Russian friendly, promote him, get him more votes, get him to actually win by way of democracy, you know what I'm saying? Will Zelensky threaten to kind of suspend the elections on behalf of the West and not allow this to move forward? Where do we stand is what I'm asking with Zelensky.
Yeah, the U.S. probably would have preferred, they liked Poroshenko over Zelensky, but Zelensky basically continued all of Poroshenko's policies and actually was harder on many issues than Poroshenko himself was. He became more nationalist than the guy who became the nationalist. And, you have to understand that all Ukrainian politics since 92 has always been and still is about the oligarchs that people owe their loyalty to. In Zelensky's case, this is Igor Kolomoisky, who owns Channel 5, He owned private bank and so on. And Zelensky has, basically rescinded Poroshenko's war on him. And he's now welcome back in the country. Instead, Zelensky is going after the oligarch Poroshenko and going after the oligarchs that back the forces of East Ukraine. It's oligarchs against oligarchs. That's still what's going on. And Zelensky, at the end of the day, I think he genuinely wanted peace at one point, but he found himself a captive of the regime that he inherited, which is kept in power by these far right, by these Banderite nationalists, both on the ground, the jackboots, but also ideologically. And he had to basically acclimate himself to them. And he's now as much a hostage to them as anyone else. I'm not saying he's a good guy, right? And, that he would change. But like Poroshenko, he has realized, what is necessary to keep this regime in power. And he has, accepted it. He has already, again, canceled elections in the regime-controlled parts of Donbass. He's silenced all the media outlets of East Ukraine. He's got both his political opponents now imprisoned on treason charges. He's a little dictator now. I mean, it's no joke. He's repressing in every way, shape, and form any criticism of his government, the leaders of the two opposition parties. And his approval rating is showing it. It's 20-some%. The regime is teetering on the edge. And now with the infighting between him and Poroshenko going on in the courts, it's really a bad time to do that with the threat of a possible Russian intervention. And I think we could see some type of underground domestic attempt to overthrow the government, possibly from both sides, possibly from both the East and West Ukraine at the same time. And the whole house of cards could come crumbling down in the face of a Russian intervention.
FUBAR.
Yes, which is effed up beyond all recognition military acronym.
So there's actually bars named after that little saying, which is kind of funny.